to the Jesu Chapel here at the Jesuit School of Theology for our Dean's lecture. It's actually more of a Dean's conversation than a lecture this year. Trying something a little bit different because Erin and I are old friends from Georgetown. So I thought a conversational setting might, as equally or even in a more compelling way, share the topic that we want to discuss tonight, because conversation is at the heart of the spiritual exercises. It's based on a conversation between the retreatant and God and the retreatant and his or her spiritual director. So we thought we'd try this setting. A word about Erin. We're delighted to have Erin with us. Erin specializes in Chinese philosophy and comparative religion, with a special focus on Chinese ethical and political thought. And more recently, she'll explain this as part of her journey as a scholar, she writes in the area of how that relates to Ignatian spirituality and interreligious dialogue. Erin is the author of 3 books, and a 4th just submitted this week, while raising 3 children, right? She has her hands full. The first one, and you'll see what's so great about Erin's life as a scholar is how she makes connections that we otherwise would not see. So her first book, from Fordham, Confucius, Rawls, and the Sense of Justice. Her second book from Columbia University Press, Families of Virtue, Confucian and Western Views on Child Development. And that may have related to your raising 3 children, I suspect. And then most recently, A World on Fire, Sharing the Ignatian Spiritual Exercises with Other Religions. Available on Amazon.com in paperback. It's well worth getting, particularly those of you who have experienced the spiritual exercises or would like to, or at the same time you learn about other religions, particularly Asian religions, as she describes that context in which to give the exercises. Erin is currently professor in the theology department at Georgetown University, where we met. I thought before Erin will give a sort of a 10-minute orientation to her project in this book, but I thought that I would first, for those of you here who are not familiar with the spiritual exercises, just give you an overview of what we mean by the spiritual exercises. So there are different exercises in the Christian tradition of the spiritual natures. But Ignatius speaks about, in his own version of the spiritual exercises, he describes, in a sense, their journey of the person who draws more closer to God and a greater sense of their mission as a disciple of Christ. And there's a certain arc in the spiritual exercises that begins with, and again, the thing about the spiritual exercises is that they're not necessarily linear. It often that you experience the grace in different times and in different ways. But I'll describe for you the arc of the exercises as Ignatius sketched them out in his own experience of God, which he then wrote down in what would become the spiritual exercises. So it begins with first an appreciation for the gift of creation and the gift of ourselves and our community within creation. So gratitude is central in the spiritual exercises. Greetings to our people from USF. Thank you for making the trek across the bridge. And then there is an encounter, having realized the goodness of God in creation, in our own creation. The person naturally may realize that they may not have cooperated with God's activity in creation as they were invited to, and so a sense of sin emerges. But that consideration of sin is always in the context of being loved by God, being created by God in love. So it is not about a berating type of encounter with sin, but a real sense of how I have not cooperated as I really want to. I've been unfree in cooperating with God's plan for creation. After experiencing the tenderness of God's mercy in a deeply personal way, considering one's personal sin and how that is caught up in the sin of the world, the person then experiences, with the help of the Gospels and some of Ignatius' own meditations, of his own making, the arc of the life of Christ. His birth, his early life, his hidden life, his public ministry, his death, and ultimately resurrection. And so the person is praying the central grace of the exercises, pray to know Christ more deeply so as to love him more dearly and follow him more closely. So a real focus on Christ, which is really will be the heart of the conversation that Erin and I will have about how do you translate this deeply Christian experience to those who are not Christian or may not have any particular religion. And then finally, the exercises end, in a sense, as it begins with wonder and awe, great gratitude for God's activity in one's life and in the world, but from the perspective of having walked with Jesus and having learned a deeper sense of one's discipleship. All along the way, the person is learning the art of discernment. That is, how do we know we're cooperating with grace or God's activity? How do we know we're getting in the way? And how might be God calling us to live out our lives as disciples of Christ? So that is the exercises into full, and those could be offered in a variety of formats over 30 days, or over, for many here, including Erin, over the course of 8 or 9 months. And also in different forms over weekends and 5-day retreats. So adaptation and flexibility is central to the spiritual exercises, which will be an important point for us to underscore this evening in our conversation. So Erin, welcome. Thank you for coming across the country to be with us.
It's my pleasure to be here with you. And I want to thank Kevin and the Jesuit School of Theology for making it possible for me to be here and everything you've done to welcome me. So the starting place for my project is the remarks made by the previous Superior General of the Jesuits, Father Adolfo Nicolas, in 2009 at Loyola Marymount, in which he urged Jesuits and those in Jesuit circles to really think harder about how the spiritual exercises can be shared much more widely, and in particular with non-Christians, including our partners in mission, but non-Christians from all over the world and many different walks of life. That, for Father Nicolas, grew out of his experience in Japan, where he spent more than 30 years in ministry, and had Buddhists who would come and ask to make the exercises. And he said for them that raised this really big question about how that it would be possible to share the spiritual exercises and what would be involved in that. So that sort of call was the starting place for my project. And it was a wonderful journey for me to explore the different ways in which Jesuits and those in Jesuit circles had begun to explore what the issues were that were involved in that. I certainly saw wonderful examples of Jesuits and others giving the exercises in shortened forms to people from other religious traditions, and to seekers, to those who were religiously unaffiliated. And so I could really see that the larger question that loomed was, would it be possible to adapt the full and complete exercises, all 4 weeks of the exercises, for members of other traditions? And so my book explores that task. And there are really 2 different tasks that I explore in the book. The first involves that full adaptation of the exercises and what's involved in that. The second task that I explore is a different way of sharing the exercises. And I explore that especially in the last chapter of the book. And another way of exploring of sharing the exercises is really to draw inspiration from them. And to innovate new spiritual exercises that represent a kind of combination of Ignatian spirituality and elements of other traditions. And so I explore that in relation to Confucianism in particular. The first chapters of the book, I explore some of the more theoretical and kind of the bigger theological questions that are involved. And then I offer case studies of adaptations in the Hindu tradition, in different forms of Buddhism, and then finally the Confucian tradition. But the first question is the question of why. Why one would do this, what the aims of this practice would be. And that's what I tackle first. And one of the things that I argue is that it really, your theological justification for this practice depends upon what your theological view is. And I think there are different theological justifications that different people would find compelling, depending upon what their view, especially of Christianity in relation to other traditions, is. I think for many people in Jesuit circles and for many many Jesuits, many people who have made the exercises, the most compelling reason for sharing them is to enrich the spiritual lives of others. Many Jesuits and many people around the world have benefited from contemplative practices, especially in the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. Those have been used pretty widely to assist people in Christian spirituality. And I think one of the questions is, can this go both ways, right? Can Ignatian spirituality, can Christian spirituality deepen and enhance someone coming from another tradition in a similar sort of way? So that why question is the first thing that I explore. And that really gets us into the aims and purposes of the exercises, what the exercises aim to do. So I take a deep dive into the Jesuit constitutions, into the text of the spiritual exercises, into the documents of the General Congregation 34 and 35, and really look at what the norms for mission are for the Jesuits, how the exercises fit into all of that, and explore all the issues that are bound up in that. The second question that I tackle is the question of how, right? So it gets more complex. You take this big question of why and then to the question of how. And there are Jesuits who have written a little bit on that topic, who have engaged it. My particular interest in the book is what do we do when we're looking at people who are members of other religious traditions, as opposed to those who are unaffiliated, although some of what I say also applies to people who are unaffiliated. So I'm interested in people who have particular theological commitments, who feel really tied to and rooted in a particular religious tradition. And what's involved when these very different theological views and practices sort of meet up, and how that fits together. So my position really is somewhere in the middle of a spectrum, and I'm definitely seeking a balance. So you have someone like Roger Haight, who writes especially about Christian spirituality, Ignatian spirituality for seekers, for people who are unaffiliated. And he is very comfortable when it comes to adapting the exercises. He argues that we should adapt them very, very liberally. He's comfortable taking God out of the picture and having people think in terms of what they understand to be absolute value and how they relate their lives to absolute value. So there's definitely a sort of decentering of the exercises where the exercises become not even theocentric on that kind of view. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a Jesuit like William Reiser, who has written about his concerns with adaptation, and his belief that it really would not be possible for the exercises to be given to non-Christians, especially because I think on his view, the exercises presuppose that someone is already part of the Christian tradition. His worry especially is what he calls kind of recreating the Jefferson Bible, where we're going to cut out large parts of the exercises and maybe replace it with stuff from other traditions, which on his view, really is not what we should be doing. And I think that both Haight and Reiser raise really important issues for us. My aim is to sort of move in the middle of the spectrum in between their views. So I think that Reiser is right, that we should be concerned about removing too much of the exercises. On my view, one of the reasons we want to be careful about that is that we don't want to tamper with what really works and is meaningful about the exercises. I also think that for members of other traditions who are especially drawn to Ignatian spirituality or interested in it, seeking it, I think it would be a little odd for them if they then encountered a version of the exercises that was totally different and that didn't involve Jesus, right? I think that would be a little odd for them in terms of what they're seeking and what they're expecting. I do, though, think I'm not comfortable going as far down the spectrum as Roger Haight is willing to go. And again, I think the concern would be, I think we need to adapt, and we want to be faithful to adaptation. which has always been a part of Ignatius's vision for the exercises, many different kinds of adaptations. And so I talk in terms of layers of adaptation. I mean, you have the retreat layer, different ways of making the exercises with Ignatius right from the start. And this is incredible, given the time and place in which he lived. I mean, you have to think about how amazing this is, that he is wanting to make the exercise accessible to people from all walks of life. That's just amazing for someone in his time and place to have seen that and to have wanted to do that. And then designed the retreats that would be accessible even to people who have families and jobs, so that it's possible for them to make the exercises. So you have the retreat layer. Then you have these personal adaptations that are made for each person based on their temperament, based on their background, that he writes beautifully and talks beautifully about. And we have this marvelous tradition of giving the exercises. When I made the exercises, I made them in a cohort of about 12 people. And all of us made the exercises in a different way, as many of you have, because our temperaments are different, our backgrounds are different. And so that adaptation layer is very much in a personal way. We also broadly have cultural and historical adaptations. And you see that, again, in this really, really long history of giving the exercises, so that our understanding of hell and what we believe about hell and our theological views look a little different, and our images are different than what Ignatius originally had in mind. And so they're adaptations at that level based on the time and place in which we're living. So what I propose is that I think for members of other religious traditions, we would have another layer of adaptation that's rooted in what religious tradition you're coming from. And I think the goal is to be faithful to that tradition of adaptation and to build upon that wonderful tradition of adaptation in the Ignatian tradition, and to add an additional layer to that in what one does. I am very resistant to, and we can talk more about this, to what I call a search and replace sort of approach to the exercises. So I'm a specialist in other religious traditions, and I think it's very tempting for us to think that we all sort of have the same resources and the same kinds of figures and the same themes running through our traditions, and certainly we share many different things across different religious traditions, but there are also very real differences. And I think in this kind of task, we don't want to minimize that. I think in order to really do this well, we have to be really honest about the differences and the tensions. So what I advocate is giving a pretty traditional form of the exercises where we're not going in and trying to remove major elements of the exercises. But we adapt especially for impediments, which is really that's when we adapt for Christians too, when they run up against impediments. So I argue that I think part of what we want to do is follow the principles that have really been established in the Ignatian tradition already as we adapt for different Christians. I think we want to remember the diversity among Christians to whom the exercises are given and not minimize that, because there's a lot of adaptations for different Christians. But I also argue that in some places we will want to add elements from particular religious traditions, from an exercitance religious tradition. And that might involve adding particular texts, particular prayers, particular figures, especially when the person is really wrestling with the exercises at a certain point and is desiring something more and needing something as a bridge to help the exercises to make sense and in order to feel at home in this different tradition and some of these different ways of praying.
Thank you. So that you summarize well your argument in the book and some of your conclusions. But let me just take a step back. Before the book was written, we try to teach our students here to write from a deep sense of vocation or calling or passion. So writing from a sense of what they are really interested in or a need they perceive in the world or something missing in scholarship, that really can animate their writing and thinking over some, it could be very challenging hours of being alone in a library and looking at a blank page or screen, and so there must be some deep conviction underneath their project. So how can you describe just as a person, as a Christian, as a person, as a Christian, as a scholar, how did this book come to be written?
This book is a direct outgrowth of my experience making the exercises. And so when I made the 19th annotation retreat, there was not an area of my life that was left untouched by the exercises. And we can talk more about what that looked like. But the exercises made me a much better mother and wife. They made me a better teacher. They led me to think about my vocation as a teacher and as a scholar really differently in a host of different ways. And even just on a daily basis, my responses to people were really changed by my experience making the exercises and by the relationship that was built, the relationships that were built at the center of the exercises for me. So as I finished the exercises and began to discern what am I coming away from this experience with, I knew that a part of the call for me would involve my scholarly work. And so initially with this project, as I became aware of this conversation and this kind of interest in Jesuit circles, I began to realize that my particular background and expertise would give me some tools to approach this project. But it's been a new experience for me to be sort of orienting myself within and speaking from the perspective of the Jesuit tradition, the Ignatian tradition, because I'm used to speaking from the standpoint of a scholar of Confucianism, a scholar of Taoism, a scholar of Asian religions. So I've had the opportunity to grow in a variety of ways in my scholarly profile. That's been an odd experience at times, and it was utterly shocking to my colleagues in the field of Chinese and comparative philosophy and religion. And so Antron took me over to the library, the East Asian Studies library at Berkeley, and we were walking through the library and looking at the wonderful collection that they have of all these texts that I love and have immersed myself in, spent years translating. And I remembered this. I have a colleague in my field who really renowned scholar and translator of classical Chinese texts, very good friend of mine, and was always just very helpful to me as I developed as a scholar. And he had a postdoc at Berkeley for part of his translation project. And I remember when he asked me what I was working on, and I was just starting to work on this project, and I'll never forget the look on his face when I said, well, it's a book that deals with Ignatian spirituality and the Ignatian spiritual exercises and how to adapt them for members of other religious traditions. And he just looked at me with this blank look. It just did not make any sense. And so, so it's been an adventure, and it's been something that has changed me as a scholar in a lot of different ways and changed the fields in which I worked. And I guess there were moments where I thought, how is this gonna? What do I do? What kind of scholar am I? Am I becoming as a result of this? But it was always really guided by the knowledge that I was responding to a call that I couldn't ignore.
Great, thank you. So we're going to invite your questions in a moment. Let me give you, let's go to some challenging cases, right? So for practitioners here, to see how this might look like in practice. So do you want to, let's say if I'm going to name a part of the exercises, and if you then would indicate some advice about how a director might approach this text of the exercises for a certain retreatant. So let's ascribe a certain religion to that retreatant. What religion would you like to refer?
Buddhism.
Buddhism? Okay, so let's assume that a Buddhist woman is encountering the exercises. Let's just assume it's in the setting of an American university, right? So we have at Santa Clara, Georgetown, whatever. So American context, a woman who is steeped in the Buddhist, so she's a religious woman, so steeped in the Buddhist culture or Buddhist religion. So you get to the beginning of the exercise is all this wonderful stuff about how much God loves us and, gratitude for creation. That can be very accessible. What do we do when we get to that part of the exercises on sin? So in the exercise, either social sin, sin in the world, or sin of the person before God.
Yeah. So, I mean, much depends on which Buddhist you're working with, right? And so there's just, I mean, I think Buddhism, I mean, you take any religious tradition and there's incredible diversity in it. Sometimes I'm really struck by the diversity just among my Catholic friends alone. And that's amazing, right? But there's incredible diversity. But the Buddhist tradition is especially diverse. And partly because you have some Buddhists who are really not theists at all. And I think of some of my Zen Buddhist colleagues and friends. You have other Buddhists who really are theists and who practice, who venerate different deities, and where that's a really essential part of their belief and practice. I think one of the questions then is, as the question of sin comes up, what are the images and figures and texts that speak to the particular person who's grappling with what's happening in the exercises, and what are the movements from the person? I think I think some of the most challenging cases involve non-theists, non-theistic Buddhists, and so at many points in the exercises, because what we do is ultimately, I mean, the exercises are, we're building a relationship, and Ignatius is working to prepare the ground for a real encounter with God, right? And so I think someone has to be willing to, and really longing to, and desiring to entertain this question of, what if it's true, right? What if God is there? What do I want to say to God? And what do I feel in response to that? So I think there are many points in the exercises where it will be helpful for a non-theistic person coming from that form of Buddhism to sort of entertain that and to say, can I use my imagination in an Ignatian way? And there are great resources in the Ignatian tradition for this. So I think a very Ignatian approach is to say, I'm going to imagine that there is a God, right, who's listening to me and who wants a relationship with me, and what do I say? Right? How do I respond? How do I feel? And to work within that space of the imagination, so that we're drawing upon Ignatian methods, but also meeting a person where they are. I mean, I think any member of another tradition who's interested in the exercises and drawn to them really needs to be someone who's looking for an experience that differs from the experiences that different other contemplative practices offer, right? I mean, we just have this incredibly rich and diverse array of contemplative practices across different religions and cultures. And so I think someone needs to be aware of kind of what waters they're wading into with Ignatian spirituality, and be longing for that, be drawn to that, be desiring a different kind of experience, and then be willing to open themselves up to that possibility.
Let's say the third week of the exercises looks at the death, the passion and death of Jesus Christ. So, and it's heavily laden in Scripture. So you're reading from a particular gospel. So for that Buddhist woman, what do you do in presenting her those Scriptures, and then the content of the Scriptures, which is the death, the passion and death of Jesus?
I think for each person, and this is true for Christians, this is true for members of other religious traditions, there are particular texts and figures and stories that speak to us from our own tradition. So I think for some Buddhists coming from different traditions, there will be particular stories about suffering that resonate and that may be meaningful to meditate on in the third week and alongside all of that. But I also think a part of what the exercises really are inviting us to do is to walk with Jesus the whole way. And I remember that part of the exercises. It's a quiet and long walk to the cross, right? And I remember being struck by that quiet. But so much of the exercises center on a willingness to take that journey with Jesus and to get to know Jesus and to build a relationship with Jesus. Spending time every day in the 19th Annotation Retreat, every day walking beside Jesus, encountering people who are sick, encountering people who are dying, who are suffering, looking into their eyes beside Jesus, touching them as Jesus is touching them, is something that led me to view the world in a really different way. The year that I made the exercises was also the year that our oldest son, our oldest child, Patrick, was diagnosed with autism. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday evening. And that's been a difficult journey, and a journey that in an ongoing way has great uncertainty to it. But I really, especially in some of the experiences that we were having with Patrick as he was leaving the classroom and the school that he was in and entering special education settings. Ignatius says tears are significant, so yes. Bear with me. This is, this is real, right? I couldn't help but be very, very aware of the experience that I was having beside Jesus on a daily basis with the exercises as I watched Patrick in his new classroom with these children with all different kinds of disabilities. And one particular experience really stood out and just made what was happening very, very clear to me. And we went to this gathering that had children from Patrick's school and from his new class. As we were entering this field where all these children were playing, Patrick said, "That's my friend Nathaniel." And he went running over to this child and threw his arms around this little boy who was severely, severely developmentally disabled. And I watched my son doing this, and I realized that it was so close to the experience that I was having on a day-to-day basis as Jesus was embracing people of all kinds of all forms of suffering, all kinds of challenges, all kinds of appearances. And I really believe, I believe that experience of walking with Jesus and of having one's life and one's perspective, one's way of viewing the world and even one's own children and what's happening with them, having that transformed, I really believe that that's something that is reachable by people who are not Christians and people coming from different traditions. I really think that's something that moves across those lines.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. But just on Scripture, just to be clear, you as a director would still offer them the Christian Scriptures and maybe complement that with something from their own tradition.
Yeah.
But the idea is that, well, what is the idea there? What are they to do with the Christian Scripture?
Yeah, I think they are to do the same thing that Christians do, which is to get acquainted with Jesus and who he is, and develop a relationship with him.
Let me raise a question that you might get, having made that a very compelling argument. Somebody say, well, is the point of this trying to convert them?
No. Right? I think that one of the things that Ignatius is wonderfully clear about is that God is really the director of the exercises, and that the person who accompanies others making the exercises is to be just that, someone who accompanies, but not someone who specifies a certain end that's the goal. In a way, the exercises, I think, for all of us involves different kinds of conversions, right? That often involves staying in one's own religious tradition, but experiencing a conversion and different kinds of conversions. But I think it's not really for us to specify this is the fixed goal. I think it's so central to the exercises that Ignatius is so clear on the fact that we have to sort of, I think those who accompany others and those who give the exercises to others are working to sort of provide support, but to not get in between God and the individual.
I think you make a great point about even the Christian or the Catholic Christian will be translating the exercises to their own context, which is a very good point. So any questions for Erin or thoughts or feedback for her. If you would just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Chris Hadley. I'm on the faculty here, teach systematic theology. And it sounds like what you were just, this is kind of an observation which maybe you can respond to. But it sounds like what in the story that you were just relating about walking with Jesus, and then as a result of that, seeing something in the world just suffused with meaning. And how you adapt that for somebody who's not a Christian but who wants to do the exercises. It sounds like there's, and I'm going to use the word symbol here, and we're talking about Jesus, so not to get into the whole Roger Haight Jesus symbol of God debate, but I think I agree with Roger Haight that if a symbol is really it allows for some kind of transcendence. There are some symbols that you can just let them work and let them do their, you can just let them do their work with the person, and then you get out of the way and just trust that what that symbol is going to do for that person, it will do. Is that, because we're trying to understand symbols and the symbolic nature of religious experiences in one of my classes. So this is me doing homework, trying to get a free or to be corrected if there's another way that you would think about that.
Yeah. So as a philosopher, I'm going to say it depends on how you understand the symbol, right?
Yeah.
I think, I think experience and the experiences that we have by using the imagination are really central to the exercises. In a way, one of the things that really impresses me about the exercises is the way in which Ignatius allows us to have these encounters and these experiences without them being too weighed down by theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you don't want to scaffold it too much for the person. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at. Is like rather than thinking, oh, they're not a Christian, so I need to find something else to replace Jesus with.
Exactly.
No, let's just just give them the text and see what happens.
Yeah, and then when someone really runs up against impediments, or when something seems especially foreign, and I think that is bound to happen. And it's bound to happen at different places for different people. And in some traditions, particular movements in the exercises will be more difficult than others. It really depends. But I think when that happens, I think we want to use the resources of someone's own tradition as bridges, and not as replacements, but hopefully really as something that is an addition, that one adds to a colloquy, that one adds to a meditation. That can be a stepping stone to help someone get back into the exercises and get past the impediment that they're facing.
I think you made a great point earlier about that a Christian may face impediments that they need to help negotiate. A woman may struggle with the scriptures that are given to her in the exercises. Someone who is the meditation on hell or sin can be very problematic for someone who has been berated and not been shown the mercy of God. So Christians must also work through those impediments with a great director. And I think what's really important here is that you're working with a director in a conversation to negotiate these very important questions. Other questions for Erin or comments? Yes. Oh, Vivian, welcome back. Oh, Vivian from graduated last year? May. In the MDiv program. Vivian, welcome.
Thank you. So I'm doing a clinical pastoral education residency program at UCSF, and I'm working with patients both in the psych unit and those who are in their rooms, like with terminal illnesses. And I went in there excited about me knowing about Ignatian spirituality, and that I could hold meditations and all this with these groups of people. But somehow I kind of hit a dead end when I had to work with psych patients and getting into the imagination bit, I lost them completely. I lost a couple of them. And my expectation actually when I came to this was how we can use these exercises for people who don't belong to a particular faith belief, but this would be like a rich way of helping them, like meditate and connect to the divine, whoever the divine is for them. One for a group like in the psych unit, and then the other would be like someone who's really, really in comfort care. How do I talk about sin? How do you even go around the theme of sin with someone who's in comfort care?
Yeah. And I'll let Kevin. I mean, I think one of the interesting, things for us to think through, and that I often find myself thinking through in continuing to wrestle with the exercises, is that there's a way in which the exercises can be used really explicitly in our work, like what you're describing. There are also ways in which we live the exercises. Through the way that we see others and through the way that we interact with others, and through the resources and strength that we find to do the work that we have to do, which is sometimes really, really difficult work. And so I think in some of those cases, I think we want to continue to think about how to use the exercises in different contexts and make them available to people, who are in really facing really different kinds of challenges and really different kinds of suffering. I also think we want to think about how we go into the world differently as a result of our experience with the exercises, and how we view others differently and interact with each other differently, and find the resources to respond differently as a result of having made the exercises. Do you want to?
I agree with that. And just to say that, a fundamental premise of the exercise is that God is already at work in the person. So the question for us is how? To treat that encounter as holy ground. To say, well, God is laboring in this person. How? The second reminder is the exercises are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. There's some people who can look at the exercises and want to just domesticate them. Or make people go through them rigorously. And that has been part of the Jesuit tradition of another time. Some Jesuits of another time could describe that experience of having been raised through the exercises regardless of where they were. So we have not always been good in the society of translating the tradition. But in the original form, the point was having the person encounter the merciful love of God and Jesus Christ. And if the exercises help there, great. If they don't, we need to be flexible in approach. Thanks, Vivian. Other questions or comments? Yes, Paul.
I just wanted to make I'm so glad you concentrate on the imagination. And as a person who teaches sacramental theology, you talk about a sacramental imagination as a way of seeing and a way of being in the world. I think it requires that the director has to have that iconic imagination to encounter the other who's different. Don't you agree?
Yes, yeah. And the director is incredibly important, within the context of these kinds of adaptations, yeah. I think directors are going to need to especially practice discernment and discern adaptations in some of these cases, the more challenging cases of adaptation. And really draw upon those resources of the imagination, like you're saying. That's incredibly important. And I talk a little bit at the end of the book also about just some of the practical pieces of that. I think which are going to involve if this is something that we want to do well, then we do need to look at what the resources are in Jesuit seminaries in terms of a person's education about other religious traditions, and how many resources are available and how that gets negotiated within the context of coursework, how available that is, and also spiritual director training programs. There are some kind of practical elements that we have to be attentive to if this possibility is to be realized. And I think the idea isn't to train experts in other religions, but to provide a better grounding in them so that there are more resources for the spiritual director to draw from.
Other questions or comments? Julie?
Julie Ruby, I'm on the faculty as well. I'm wondering, Erin, what do you think draws people of other faiths to the exercises? I mean, it seems very much tradition specific, and yet something is making them want to try it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there are some different, so I spent a lot of time as I was starting to work on the project, talking with Jesuits really all over the world about the idea of doing this, about what they've seen, who's approached them about the exercises, what they've done with the exercises. And I think really, I mean, if we look at the experiences of spiritual directors so far, including some of the shortened people who have, from other traditions who have made parts of the exercises, done like an 18th annotation, there's some different profiles of those people. In some cases, you have someone who is sort of very much rooted in their tradition, but also longing for something more and wrestling with some questions that are pushing them outward, that are pushing them towards some other contemplative practices. And I will say that, I mean, I know Christians who have been drawn to Buddhist meditation for precisely those reasons, and who didn't leave the Christian tradition, but who turned to other traditions for resources that spoke to what they were needing spiritually, that they didn't find in their own tradition. So I think some people are going to fit that profile. I think some are going to be people who are further out on the fringes of their tradition, who are really wondering about some of their theological commitments and some of what their tradition teaches. Many of those people will be people who, in some cases, are married to or are close friends with members of other traditions who have encountered the exercises. And I think also people who teach at Jesuit institutions, and I know some people who fit this profile, who have a great appreciation for Ignatian spirituality, for the resources in the Jesuit tradition, the values, but who really have heard people talk about the spiritual exercises and would really like to experience them and know that there's something there and are interested in experiencing them for themselves. So I think there are going to be a lot of different profiles of people and the degree of rootedness in their tradition, the degree to which they're searching for something beyond what their tradition has to offer.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm going from Vietnam. I'm Vietnamese Jesuit. I'm doing the first year of STL in Ignatian Spirituality.
Great.
My question relates to the grace in the exercises, because I understand the grace in the exercise is very important, because it talk about the goal or the purpose of the exercise. I ask you how you adapt to guide people, especially for the Buddhists. They don't know Jesus or they do not believe in Jesus. How can we adapt for the grace for the week 2 or week 3 of spiritual exercise? Father Dean just mentioned before, how can we ask them to know Jesus deeply, to follow Him closely and love Him dearly. And as you said, you will use their own story and their own hero to adapt for the second week or third week. How can you adapt or help them to ask for the grace?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think thinking in terms of the different gifts and graces that are a part of the exercises and different movements of the exercises is a helpful starting place for members of other traditions to think about what gift the person is seeking at different points in the exercises. I mean, I also think, and this is one of the reasons that I don't I don't think we want to be too aggressive about going in and tampering with the exercises too much, is that I think Ignatius has a very intentional sort of process, right? A very intentional journey that people go on. So there are certain, by the time you get to the third week, it would be strange to drop someone into that, right? If they hadn't been on this journey, right? And it's a slow, there's slow work that's involved in that journey, just like any relationship that's built. And ultimately, the relationships are central in the exercises, right? The relationship with God, the relationship with Jesus, the relationship with Mary. Those relationships are really central, and it takes time to build those relationships. And so I think an important part of how that works is to allow the person to take that journey and to take it step by step, and to build those relationships in the very distinctive way that each of us builds those relationships. And I think there's so much, I think we don't want to underestimate the amount of diversity that we see in Christians. And I'm always, as someone who is a specialist in other traditions, I'm always keen to remind us of the differences between different religious traditions. That's really important, and those differences do loom large. But I also think we can really learn a lot from the diverse experiences of Christians. So for me, when I made the exercises coming from a Protestant background, I had never encountered Mary in prayer before. And so the first time that I hit that first triple colloquy, I'm like, Mary, like what am I doing here? What is this? Right? This is new, right? And I talked a little bit last night about how images of Mary, particular artwork, was helpful to me. My spiritual director brought those images in and sort of let me work with them. And I was able to get past sort of that initial resistance. There was an impediment for me, right? It seemed very foreign, right? This is a different figure. I knew Mary, like, from the story, right? But in terms of in prayer, I didn't. But as, considering different images of Mary, Henry Ossawa Tanner's image of Mary, the Annunciation, which was for me so faithful to the reality of her experience and the fear and the uncertainty that was a part of her story. I had a really profound experience and encounter with Mary through the exercises, and my prayer life was permanently changed as a result of building that relationship, and it was a new relationship for me. And my third child has the middle name Mary because of that experience. And we were discerning whether to have a third child as I was making the exercises. I have a good friend who also made the exercises, also coming from a Protestant background. And he ran up against the same impediment. It seemed really foreign. His spiritual director suggested some different things. Well, let's see, what can you think about? What are some different ways? And you've got to keep trying. And he just wasn't able to, just really couldn't get it. Couldn't get past it. The experience wasn't happening. So his spiritual director eventually said, "Well, you come from a Pentecostal background. Why don't you pray this colloquy with the Holy Spirit instead of Mary?" And that was the adaptation. And the triple colloquy for him ended up being a really, really moving experience for him with the Holy Spirit. And very faithful then to what Ignatius is envisioning in prayer, but an adaptation. But our experiences were really different. Even, both coming from a Protestant background, I was able to move past that impediment and had this really profound encounter. He needed something different, right?
Yeah. That same friend, when the directors were working through how to help our retreatants, we suggested to his director that he offer more Pauline scripture. There's very little Paul in the prescriptions of the Ignatian exercises. I'm not sure Ignatius describes any Pauline passage. so we said, well, time to adapt. And that opened up the retreat for him by introducing more Pauline scriptures. And after that, I was encouraging our friend to say, well, he's a Pentecostal and an ordained minister. Write an article about that, right? Because I do think for our students here, the scholarship, and Hung could perhaps hopefully agree to this, the scholarship that's, to me, most desperately needed in the exercises is adaptations to different contexts. I think it's vital and it's needed. People are hungry. Yes. But these are really hard questions. So if you're Vietnamese, in your context of Vietnamese religions, different types of Buddhism, for instance, how do you do it in that context? There's been some stuff written about Judaism, a little bit easy because we share at least part of the scriptures we can offer during the beginning weeks of the exercises. But what happens when a Jewish person encounters Jesus? So there's been some writing there, but more needs to be done. And certainly, if you're in an African context, a Middle Eastern context, how do we deal with the exercises in the Muslim communities, in the different types of Islam, right? So this is territory that I feel very strongly, I'm not equipped to go because I'm not a scholar in other religions. That's why this is such a gift for us, Erin. So let me offer, give us another chance for a question.
I'm in a training program to give the 19th annotation. I hate to be so crass to ask a marketing question, but I don't work in an academic environment where you have lots of people coming from different walks. How have you encountered where been able to let it be known that the exercises are available to people in another situation? I can easily see it in an academic environment.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm just trying to reach Dominicans. I can't get that far.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good thing for us to think about and to think more about. I think honestly, when it comes to the spiritual exercises, I think it's important for all of us who make the spiritual exercises to share really openly and really broadly about our experiences and to really work at opening up and talking about our experiences. And I think there's no really replacement for that sort of first-person encounter with someone who has made the exercises and who has found them meaningful. I think regardless of what background you're coming from, I think that's really important.
Yeah, and to remember, to lead someone initially through the 19th annotation would be running a marathon without practicing first, right? So I think a very, very, very important is to introduce modules of the exercises. Days of prayer, weekends of prayer, 5-day retreat, and everyday life. And the universities do that, but I think you raised a really important question for us. How do we offer the exercises outside these traditional settings? So thanks for asking. So Donald Godfrey from University of San Francisco. Julia Lamb also from San Francisco. Julia, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for writing this book. And Erin, I think it's a model that can be used. You pick certain faith traditions, but it can be used in many different contexts. It's a model that can be used with all kinds of people, and it's and I think you mentioned towards the end of the book about it. Many of the people in our institutions are getting attracted by something in the Jesuit mission, and then, but sometimes they don't even hear about the exercises. And we offer the exercises to staff and faculty each year through the 19th annotation. Around maybe 10 people. It depends on the year. But I find people coming who say, I'm an atheist or an agnostic, have come and asked to make the exercises because they're attracted by something in the Jesuit mission. And so we discern together, and I've said yes to some of them, and but of course I have to explain to them, this is what you're going to be. So there's some desire at some level. I explain, this is what we'll be doing, and of course, I'm not trying to make you, and of course I'll be respectful, but so there's something in them that wants to go through the exercises. And I found they can be very powerful, and people, wherever it goes, it's not up to me. I have to have the faith that it's what God wants to do in this person's life. It's not about me. And of course it's always temptation to control.
Yeah.
But but they're very liberating and freeing, and the people, it's life-changing for people, and it's also, they have a new understanding of the Jesuit mission that is very powerful, and they engage with it in a much deeper way, and it's exciting to watch that. But somehow, usually we get through all 4 weeks.
And you're making a really important point, which is that for someone coming from another tradition, it's important for them to know what they're getting into.
Yes.
And so, part of that preparatory period and leading up to the exercises, especially for members of other religions, really needs to include a process of really learning what's involved. And how the story goes, right, and what the movements are, so that they can, work with you to discern whether it's the right, whether it's the right thing. Yeah, good. Thank you.
We're just about at the end of our time. Is there a final question or comment? Kyle.
Kyle Schensecker. I'm a SDLC. I was kind of wondering, so, as someone enters into the exercises and they're developing this relationship, it's one thing if they're coming from a Christian tradition and can go back to their Christian community and continue to foster that relationship. But what happens to that relationship if they go back to a Buddhist tradition, Indian tradition? Are you kind of leaving them?
That's a great question.
Out on road? Or I'm just kind of wondering how do you think?
Yeah, I think a great question for us to consider more broadly is what happens to people after the exercises. There's a broader question for us to work on, and set of issues to work on there in terms of where one goes. I think it's clearly going to depend on where a person is sort of what their resting place is as they're coming out of the 4th week, and where they are, and what they're where they're being led, right? So I think spiritual directors are going to have to be available to work with the person, especially if they're a bit decentered in terms of where they're at, in terms of their tradition, because the next step then is going to be working through some of that, right? But I think the larger question of what happens following the exercises for people is a really important one. It was hard. After I'd finished the exercises, it was hard. It was hard being done with them, right? And I can see a lot of heads nodding, right? And so I think there's a larger question for us to consider, which is it's a really robust question. Yeah.
Thank you. So we know Ignatius would often speak in the Constitutions about the call to help souls, to help people. He liked that phrase because he was very practical, that everything we do should be about helping souls and people. So Erin, your scholarship, and you're talking about it, people who read this book and the spiritual directees who are helped because their spiritual directors read this book and listened to you, that means a lot of people have been helped. So we were very grateful. Thank you for this great contribution, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.